both written for young adults. This one is called Comfort, and this one is called Take Me There. Comfort I wrote based on my experiences in a small Texas town. And it was not called Comfort, it was actually called Happy Texas. I don't know what the population is of your town. How many people live in Gallup?
19,000.
19,000. That would be huge compared to Happy Texas. So when I was in my teenage years, my family lived in Southern California. You said you used to live in California? We lived in Southern California. That was the most boring place on the planet.
I lived in
The Bay Area. It was probably more exciting. I lived in this little town, and although there were exciting things to do there, my family never did any of those exciting things. The beach was not that far, and Disneyland was not that far, but we went to Disneyland maybe once a year, and our town was small. We had one movie theater. So when they said we were moving to Texas, I got really excited. We moved to Lubbock. Have you guys ever been to Lubbock? Anybody ever been to Lubbock? Is it exciting? Maybe compared to Gallup, but not compared to California. So we got to Lubbock, Texas, and I thought, wow, it was really different because Texas is so flat that you can literally like stand on the road and turn and look all the way around, and it feels like you can see the end of the earth because you can see where the sky meets the ground. And it's a little scary because it looks like the earth isn't that big anymore. Like your world has gotten really small. So we were looking at the sites of Happy Texas, and so we found this. Look, it was in the phone book. Sites of Lubbock, Texas, and it was Prairie Dog Town. So I got sort of excited because I thought, well, Prairie Dog Town is probably going to be like Knott's Berry Farm, where they've got rides and cool attractions and things like that. But when we got there, it really was a prairie dog town with like mounds of dirt and prairie dogs, and this high concrete fence all around it. So I realized at that moment that Lubbock, Texas was not going to be the exciting place that I thought it was. So 2 years later, when my dad said, guess what, we're moving to Happy Texas, I did not get very excited. Did you guys go to Gallup High School? Mm-hmm. How many students are in your high school? 1,500. That's like more than double what was in the town of Happy, Texas. In the town of Happy, Texas, there were about 623 people.
I go to Central High, and there's only like 200 there.
Wow. So that's, in my senior class, there were 23 people. At the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, there were only 16. All the rest were girls who got pregnant and dropped out. Like 7 girls got pregnant and dropped out before the end of the year. And I don't know why they didn't finish. They could have stayed and finished, but it was kind of like, well, they didn't feel like there was any reason to continue. So I really applaud people who stay in school when they have challenges, because they could have. It would have been easy for them to stay in school, and they just quit. So when I wanted to write this story, now when I was living in Happy, Texas at the time, I just thought it was the worst experience in the world. But there was one teacher who was a journalism teacher, and there was nothing else to do, so I got involved in journalism. And so I was on the school paper, and she said that everybody who was involved in journalism had to take part in these contests. In Texas, they're called University Interscholastic League competitions. And that's a really big fancy word for these types of competitions, where basically there's a school competition, and then there's a district competition, a regional competition, a state competition. It's a lot like football, like the way that football is run. In fact, UIL also governs the football competitions. And so she said we had to get involved, and there were all sorts of, the cool thing about it was there were all sorts of things. You could do science or spelling bee, or what I did was news writing, editorial writing, and poetry interpretation. What poetry interpretation was is you found these poems, and you just read them. You read them interpretively. If anybody does English Expo, they have some similar types of things. Have you guys ever done English Expo? So do they have some similar types of competitions like that? Well, in Texas, they have millions of dollars in scholarships if you get involved in the UIL. And I was an alternate to state, so even though I was coming from this tiny, tiny town, in fact, probably because I was coming from a tiny, tiny town, I had this opportunity to compete, and I got a scholarship, and I was the first person in my family to go to college because no one in my family had ever gone to college, had never even thought about going to college. And in fact, when I told my parents I was going to go to college, they said, well, you can't do that. And I said, what do you mean I can't go to college? And they said, well, only rich people can afford to go to college, and we don't have any money, so you can't go to college. And so that just made me so mad that I decided I was going to just go ahead and do it, especially since I had a scholarship. And then we were really poor, so there was a lot of grants. There were a lot of Pell Grants and things back then. There's less of that money now, but there's still money. If you don't have money, there's money available to you. There's more money in financial aid if you're poor than if you have money. You can't get financial aid if your family has money. If your family's really poor, you can probably get financial aid. So that was really good. Then I went on to college, and I went on to do other things. I eventually got a master's degree in speech pathology, and I work at Rio Rancho High School right now as a speech pathologist, and I also write books. But when I wanted to write a book, I wrote a book about my experiences. Now, even though the main character is a boy in Comfort, it's still a book about my experiences in the UIL. And so I know that a lot of you, for your project, you're going to be writing about your own personal experiences. And the way everybody really, when they write any sort of book, they are writing about their own personal experiences. It's hard to tell how much. You never know how much of a book is about an author's personal experiences. I can tell you this one is a lot about my personal experiences. It's about a boy whose father's an alcoholic, and he's just gotten out of prison, and his mother wants to make the dad into a country and western superstar, so she makes her son quit football and quit band to promote the dad, who doesn't really want to be a country and western superstar, so there's a lot of conflict. And so this boy gets involved in journalism because that's all he has left. He can do it at school, and then his teacher encourages him to take part in these poetry competitions. And so, of course, obviously I was never a boy. I never played football, and I never was even in the band. But I combined those ideas. My husband played football, so I asked him all these questions about football so it would seem authentic, and then I combined it with my experiences with the UIL. So he goes through all the competitions that I went through when I was doing poetry interpretation. So a lot of times it seems like our lives are not very interesting. And you may think, if you've lived in Gallup, I mean, how many think you have a pretty interesting, exciting life? Not very many people. You have an interesting life, yay! Has anything exciting ever happened to you? Anything interesting? So sometimes in our seemingly boring life, we have these little blips. Like most of the time, I just get up. I eat the same thing every day, oatmeal with peanut butter. I drive to work. I work all day. I come home. I make dinner. I go to soccer competitions. My life is not very exciting, but every now and then I have these little moments that are really interesting, like I got a book published. Like I got to come to Gallup and see you guys. Like Thursday, someone called me randomly and said, would you come be on the radio? And so every now and then, even though most of the time my life is pretty boring, interesting things happen. And sometimes the things I think are really boring, when I look back on them, are a lot more interesting than I thought. So you may think about maybe this last year. If you can't think of anything exciting that has happened or even mildly interesting that has happened in the last year, you might look back to when you were little, when you were a child. And sometimes the things that seemed really boring are a little bit more interesting. Like I never thought I'd read a whole book about that poetry competition. I never dreamed of that. But when I got older and I started looking back, I thought, well, that's really unique, you know? Not everybody does that. Not everybody goes and competes in reading poetry and gets a scholarship and goes to college as a result of that. So maybe other people would find it interesting. So your lives here, imagine as you're writing about your lives here in Gallup, somebody in New York City might find that fascinating because they don't have wide open places. They don't have the cultural experiences that you have. And so although when you share something, all your classmates will say, oh, yeah, I've been down to that same restaurant. I know it's not very exciting. Well, someone coming from another place might think, wow, that's really cool that you guys have such interesting culture and that you live in this wide open place. You know, most people live in really crowded cities, and they might find your life absolutely fascinating. So sometimes if you can take a step back from your experiences and write about them, almost like, you know, the difference between first person and third person. So first person is when I say I and me, and I went down to the store and I did this. And third person is talking about you. So sometimes I even write about myself in third person. Carolee got up today and she thought it was going to be a regular old day, and then she went to school and there was this really, the balloons started landing on the football field at school. And there was one of these big cows that just suddenly landed. It was this big hot air balloon. And Carolee said to her students, wow, look at that. Let's run out and see the balloon. You know, sometimes if you write about your experiences with a little bit of detachment, then you see them from a different perspective. Another interesting thing to do is to write in another person's perspective in first person. So I actually wrote this book in first person, even though I was never a teenage boy. I wrote as if I am a teenage boy, and I write this in first person. So sometimes when you experiment with that point of view, it gives you a little bit different perspective. Enough of a perspective that what may seem boring is interesting. Have you ever gone to the state fair and seen somebody do a photograph of something really ordinary like a flower? Or there was this really cool photograph of this guy who looked like a biker, with a bandana around his head, an earring, and he was just a regular guy. But their perspective made him look interesting. And a landscape might seem very boring, but it's your perspective of how you're looking at that, how the light hits it, that makes it really interesting. Okay, and then this book was about a boy who can't read or write. He gets in trouble with the law in California, and he goes looking for his father who's in prison in Texas. And the only thing he knows about his father, he hasn't seen him in 11 years, and the only thing he knows about him is that he's in prison. And he wants to find out, this girl on the road here, this scene is not in the book, by the way. I wish it was. I sort of wish it was. I know after they came up with that, they said, well, I know this isn't, authors don't have anything to say about the cover. My editor said, I know this scene isn't in your book, but I think it sort of captures the mood. And I was thinking, darn, I wish I'd written that scene. That's